Hey everybody, it's Drewby with DailyRoto here. Gonna do a little bit of a different thing for premium content today. Gonna try to walk through how to create teams for cash games and tournaments using the Lineup Optimizer that is new. If you haven't checked it out, it's pinned in our Slack channel. There's still a couple bugs we're trying to work out with some of the positions on FanDuel, but once that stuff is finished, which should be done shortly, we'll be able to move it to the main menu. So here you can see the projections that we have. You can see kind of the game totals across the top as well as the positional filters if you want to drill down into things. So the first thing you need to do is to be able to select a slate, and that'll filter down to the individual pricing, value rankings, and projections for that specific site. So you can see here on DraftKings main slate, Alex Ovechkin is our top projected scorer, and Robin Lehner right now is one of the top projected goalies, which makes sense just because Carolina takes such a high volume of shots at a sometimes low shooting percentage. So as small favorites, we definitely have Lehner projected pretty well. But a couple different things within the optimizer that you can do. So the first thing is, I'll just start with like the basic settings. The settings allow you to do a bunch of different things. At the top of the settings, you can configure your player exposure. And so if I was going to build a MME set of lineups, I might want to set the maximum number of exposure to any one player, maybe at 25% or 30%. It's a big slate, so there's plenty of good lines tonight. If it was a shorter slate, I might take a more aggressive stance. Similarly, I think the defensive position tonight might set it at like 40, and goalie maybe set that at 25%. The wings you don't really have to worry about if you are stacking because the center is going to control that, but if you're building for cash games or something like that, you might want to change it as well. And there is a save button at the top, so you can click the save and you can either use your own settings or revert to default settings. From here, you kind of have to make a decision as far as if you want to stack. There's options to stack with primary stacks and secondary stacks. A 3-3 stack is kind of the most common go-to stack, I would say. And then you can go to like a 3-2, or if you want a mini stack, you can do 2-2, or you can run it unstacked at all. As far as the teams, these are the teams that would be eligible for within your given stacks. You can either control that there or at the player level. And then you have the primary and secondary stack teams, as well as the position eligibility. The run settings specifically can give you a little bit more player pool diversity. So number of unique players per lineup. When I'm running MME teams, what I like to do is set that to 4. And basically what that allows me to do is ensure that none of my lineups have the same 2 stack combinations paired together. So it gives me diversity. If you set it at just 1, you might get a ton of the same top line and the same value line together, just rotated with different defensemen and goalies. And so by setting that to 4, I'm able to ensure that at least like all the 2 stacks are going to be unique. So I will never have the same 2 lines paired up together in any of my lineups. And then you can also configure the shuffle. And what the shuffle does is some of our technology that gives you a little bit more of a random sampling of some of the top lineups that you're going to be generating. From here, you can set it either to whatever you want as far as the number of lineups. 20 would be 20 teams, obviously. That's a pretty good number for 20 max, and it's a number that I think is still manageable to build with the optimizer, but hand edit. But you can also go as high as 150 lineups if you want to build for some of the real MME events on DraftKings or FanDuel. And then there's a configuration here for the number of forwards or D that are allowed versus your goalie. On a normal slate, a slate this big, I'll probably keep that at 0. On a shorter slate, I actually think it's still pretty optimal to sometimes play a defenseman against your goalie, on a 3-game slate or something like that. A lot of the volume and the points from defensemen come through block shots and shots on goal, and those aren't necessarily that negatively correlated with your goalie. So I don't think playing a defenseman against your goalie on a short slate is that bad, but it definitely would be on a larger slate when you kind of need the multi-goal upside from your defenseman if you want to compete in some of the tournaments. And then you have the position utility, so what positions are allowed in flex. And then here you can just kind of toggle where the game screen is going to appear across your lineups. And then obviously in case of emergency, you can kind of clear everything. So right now we're just going to go through and we're going to run the optimizer. We haven't selected any stacking configurations, so this is going to give you sort of the basic optimal for either of the platforms. With this software running for the recording, it definitely goes a little bit slower, especially because we do have shuffle and number of unique lineups. But if you are running more basic settings with fewer lineups generated, then this will definitely return faster. You can kind of create 150 lineups in, you can kind of count it out with me. It's been a little bit less than a minute. And obviously, if you're running fewer lineups with less complex rules and restrictions, then that's something that can generate and return lineups much faster. So if you are going to use it for cash games, I think there are a couple things to be careful of. One, you don't need to run 150, so just run like the 10 or 20 lineup set, and you can kind of pick and choose and see what the builds look like there. I think the other thing is the optimizer is never going to be perfect for cash games, and sometimes it'll give you value guys that have really low floors. And so I think it is important to kind of be careful and think about what you are doing as it relates to cash games with the optimizer, but can kind of check out some of the player exposures. So Logan Couture, Braden Shen, Ovechkin, Marcia So, Thomas Vanek, kind of like a punt value at wing, and then being able to pay up for Burns Carlson, someone like Jimmy Howard and net, Sebastian Aho, like pretty solid lineup there as far as floor. Even the punt guy like Vanek is a guy who's a shooter and plays on the power play unit. So I think, there's some merit here, and you can kind of go through the lineups. And what I like to do is kind of look, and if I see something like Andre Burakovsky, like he's a guy, even though he's 2,500, that's why he's getting into the lineups, but I definitely wouldn't trust him in cash games. And so that's where you kind of can go through, and you can actually click through here and check out your individual player exposure at the top, and then go back and kind of optimize and exclude from there. So that would kind of be the basics as far as running the optimizer. But obviously what most people are going to be using the optimizer for is tournaments and building multiple lineups for GPPs. So there are a few different things that we can do to build multiple lineups for GPPs. I think the first is just understanding what types of stacks that you want to run. The most common stacks, as I mentioned, are the 3-3 stacks. So that's stacking 3 forwards from the same line and pairing them up with another line that also has 3 forwards. If pricing is really tight, there are slates where perhaps running a 3-2 set of lineups might make sense, just because it enables you to get a little bit more value into your lineups by utilizing the flex position better and perhaps playing some of the top values. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and I'm going to set up the 3-3 stacks like we've done here. I'm also going to go through and I'm going to exclude some of the teams that I might not want in my stack. So Minnesota is on a back-to-back on the road in Boston tonight. They're a team where I think you could exclude Minnesota from both of your stacks. I think Boston in general is a tough enough matchup on a slate this big. You don't have to go too deep. Similarly, I think New Jersey and Buffalo is a spot that I'm comfortable avoiding. No, Eichel may not be back, but unless New Jersey is able to get that loaded top line with Taylor Hall back together, they're a team that I don't need to rush out and stack. Buffalo, I think I will kind of leave in consideration. Carolina is a team I'm going to avoid tonight. I know Aho is popping a little bit in the stack rankings, but the Isles have tightened up defensively, and I just think with the configurations of lines in Carolina that the multi-goal upside might not be there. Florida and Pittsburgh definitely could see some offensive value from both sides of that equation, so I'm going to be comfortable leaving those in. Philly is going to be on the back-to-back in Washington as well. So I think on a night like tonight, it might not be a night where you need to go with Philly. One of the concerns with Philly this year is after the coaching changes, their line combinations are tough to get a read on. And especially coming off of that loss to St. Louis last night, it's very possible we'd see line changes and lines juggled in this game against Washington. So the other frustrating piece is the lines they line up with in warm-ups often aren't the same as the ones that they use in the game. And it's kind of like this shtick that their coach has. I don't know what his strategy behind it is, but it's very frustrating for DFS. So unless Philly's in a great spot, for the most part, I'll be avoiding them. Montreal and Detroit, I think you can kind of leave in consideration. Montreal's on the back-to-back, but Detroit does have one of the worst penalty kills in the league, so I'll at least leave them in the player pool. And then similarly, I think that Detroit is a line, or a team rather, where we might not frequently be targeting them, but with Montreal on the back-to-back, probably starting the Emmy and net, it's a little bit of a better spot, and perhaps they have some value lines if we do want to pair up some of the top lines. So I'm going to go through there. Tampa and Columbus, I I think I'll probably avoid Columbus on this slate in Tampa. I wouldn't be surprised if there's some contrarian value in 150 max. I might leave him in there, but I'm going to be creating a 20 lineup set right here. We'll scroll over. We have the Dallas matchup in St. Louis. Definitely going to be a good spot for the Dallas top line tonight, and probably a spot where I can avoid St. Louis on the back-to-back in a reasonably tough matchup. You know what? I'm actually going to leave St. Louis in the player pool just because I think that the value of that line, and I saw Schen's price specifically was down so much, so I'll leave that line together. And then Colorado, Winnipeg, I think we can have exposure to that game in our lineups. It's not going to be the best spot for Colorado's top line, but I think it's still worth leaving them in for MME. And then you have the Rangers in Vegas. You can also exclude the teams entirely from the main menus here. The reason I didn't do that is because sometimes there are going to be value lines that we really want. So I definitely think it's a good spot for the Rangers, or not the Rangers, rather the Vegas Knights against the Rangers. And then we have San Jose versus Edmonton. Again, going to leave Edmonton in the mix just because San Jose is playing on the back-to-back at home. It's a little bit of an underrated spot in general. I think it's probably a little bit too fancy in a 20 max build to play McDavid, but if you're building 150 max, he's definitely the type of guy that can thrive in any given matchup. So I think that's one thing that I like to do. The other thing I like to do is go through some of the value defensemen and just make sure that the guys who I think might pop up in optimals are fit for the player pool. First thing you'll notice is this bug related to Sebastian Aho. I'll fix that in the projections, but it's something that you should be careful of because Aho and Josh Anderson have wings who are actually pretty good at hockey and also have defensive players with the same name, and that's been a bug we've been struggling to get out of the projections. But right here you can see the teams line as well as the individual power play lines, and going to go through and just kind of exclude some of the guys who I think don't have the same upside from the value ratings. And so what this will do is enable me to kind of exclude some of the guys that might not have 6+ point upside on a given night from my lineups. And then when I do go through and run the full set, hopefully we'll get lines that we're kind of comfortable with. So going through and just excluding kind of a bunch of the value lines. But you can kind of do that on your own. Again, go back here. We've got all the settings. I'm going to click the save button. So if we need to rerun it, and then I'm going to restrict this to a 50 lineup build right here. And we'll kind of run this and see what the types of lineups it generates are. Again, we set up 3-3 stacks. This is my favorite way of stacking in tournaments. I think it gives you the most correlation. And I know sometimes there are guys that have low ceilings relative to their lineups, and a lot of players, especially in some of the lower stakes, will try to exclude those players from consideration and go with a different lineup construction. And I really think those players end up often being the GPP winners. They definitely don't hit all the time, but when they do, they end up being the lower owned complement. And if the line's going to go off for 2 or 3 goals, they're going to be scoring at even strength most of the time as well. So a lot of folks are focused on full power play correlation, and that's definitely the preferred approach, is to have that full power play correlation. But I think if you only have the partial power play correlation, like 2 of the 3 guys, it's still okay to leave in that third winger, because a lot of times that's going to be that guy that doesn't get owned in tournaments and picks up a couple assists if the line does score 2 or 3 goals. So you can see running with this set of lineups, it's taking a little bit of time to generate, partially because of the video recording software. But in general, whenever you're running kind of complex rules that have unique lineups, stacking, shuffle, it's going to take a little bit of time to run and to generate those. So what we're going to get is the full 3-3 stack. What I typically will do is run the lineups via an optimizer. I'll then upload them to DraftKings or FanDuel, and I'll go through and I'll try to manually edit the lineups if there are upgrades or things that I think might make a little bit more sense. So you can set up rules to configure stacking. Like, one of the things I like to do is pair my goalies with one of my line stacks, but I only like to do that if the makes sense from a value perspective. So if you're using like a $7,000 goalie with the stacks, upgrading to an $8,300 goalie and a heavy favorite isn't going to make that much sense. But a lot of times you might have a lineup that's generated with, a goalie that's 0.2 DraftKings points projected ahead, and he's the same price as the goalie for one of your teams. And I think that's the opportunity that you have then to kind of go through. So here you can see the lineups returning. First optimal lineup would be the St. Louis Blues. Again, I talked briefly about maybe excluding this. I think I would control ownership of it just because they're on the back-to-back. But the price tags of this lineup, Tarasenko, Schenn, and Schwartz, are really low, and we saw the offensive upside last night. So you can see paired up with Carlson, Marchessault, Smith, and then paying up for Burns and punting with Dahlin on defense is kind of the top optimal. You can see the next one, it kind of moves through and it makes sure that it's a unique stack rotated because we set 4 uniques. So the Pittsburgh second line you can see in here. Then it moves back to Vegas with the Jets second line, Buffalo, and you can kind of go on and see that here. And if you want to look quickly and just understand your exposure, you can do it at the center level and see, okay, so I've got 26% exposure to Schenn's line, 26 to Carlson, Malkin at 22, Scheifele at 20, Rodriguez at 14, and kind of go down through. And a lot of times what I'll do is just make sure it makes sense. If there's a guy that I'm uncomfortable with playing that much exposure, then I can go through and cap it. So maybe I'm a little bit concerned about Evan Rodriguez missing some practice time and just not sure what that line's going to look like with like Reinhart and Skinner. And so maybe that's a line where I'd cap the exposure a little bit and go back through. But what you can do then is you can download these lines and you'll be able to upload them immediately into DraftKings or FanDuel and go through, and you can make whatever adjustments you want to the lineups once they're uploaded in there. It's pretty simple. But that's kind of how I would go about building tournament lineups on DraftKings with the basic steps. I would say that the secondary steps specifically that I would sometimes do is go through and try to correlate my goaltenders. And if you're building, like I said, if you're building 5 to 20 lineups, a lot of times it's going to be easier just to run the optimizer and create the lineups. And I'm going to wait for this to refresh and manually edit them. But if you are going to build a 150 lineup set, there's also some additional things that you might want to do. So again, we're going to select our slate, DraftKings main slate. And a lot of the stuff that you can do is from within the groupings. So the first thing would be going with a Pittsburgh power play stack. And one of the things you could do here is to create a group that ensures if you're playing Crosby or Malkin, you can set a group that ensures anytime you use Chris Letang that it uses at least one of Malkin or Crosby. So that'd be one way to try to get some defensive correlation. Another way would be with the goalies. So you look at some of the top goalies tonight, and Vasilevsky is one of the top rated goalies that we have, but you might only want to play Vasilevsky if he's in a correlated lineup because he is carrying such a high price tag. So what you can do here is add Kucherov to the group. Can add Stamkos to the group. And you can make sure that all your lineups with Andrei Vasilevsky include at least one of Stamkos or Kucherov. And so on a slate this big, like I said, if I'm only building 10 or 20 lineups, it's a lot of the times it's just easier to create the lineups and then edit them manually than it is to create the groups. But if you are building a set, you can kind of go through and you can narrow down your goalie pool, figuring out who you want to play at each individual position. And then you can go through and you kind of create groups for each of them. So yeah, that's a quick optimizer tutorial for DraftKings and FanDuel, and definitely check it out. We'll make sure to pin it in the menu bar when we're all set.